mean, that is mind-numbing to think that in this part of the world, not that far from the Cregagh Road, there were men and women who settled near the banks of the River Lagan, and they built this fantastic tomb structure, and they must have had a settlement nearby. And it is amazing to think that that actually predates the pyramids. You know, we sometimes think that we Northern Ireland, you know, it's not that significant, but it has had civilization for, you know, this is just after the most recent ice age. So really, our civilization goes back as far as most, in terms of of modern times. So in terms of the earliest times, we could look back to the settlement of man in way back 4,000 years before Christ, and settling there over by Minnoburn, near the Beaver estate on the banks of the Lagan. And so that's there is strong evidence for early settlement in that area. And indeed, if we go to the Ulster Museum, we can find the Malone axe heads, which are highly polished, formed through rubbing the stone with sand and water until they got this polished effect. And these instruments must have been highly prized at the time. And these, of course, were dug up over at Danesfort near Stranmillis. So we have strong evidence, and and all I'm wanting to do is really touch the surface as to, you know, that this area is really quite important when it comes to the settlement and civilization in Ireland and in Northern Ireland, of course. And the wonderful thing is you can go and see those stones and have a look at them. And, you know, when you start to think back that some man, probably a man at that time, given the way tasks would have been handed out, back 6,000 years ago, I would imagine it probably was a man, but some man took these stones and sat with them on his knee and rubbed and shaped and chiseled. But, you know, it's amazing to think that you could hold something in your hand that somebody so far disconnected in time, you know, and we can go and look at this in our wonderful local museum. So Belfast, this was pulled from a children's book, probably nicked from Knockbreda Primary School. When I left, I cleared everything when I left, as Alison will tell you. I'll tell you a quick story, but the teacher who was taking my place came to me and said, "Are you leaving all your notes?" And I said, "No, of course I'm not. I had wall-to-wall files with notes." And I said, but you can take a copy of anything you want. But needless to say, she didn't do that. But my notes went with me. In fact, they're still in the store in Monterey Primary School, and I really must bin them. But this is a book, and really what I'm asking here is, why on earth did early man, if you like, settle in Belfast, in the area of Belfast? This is the region. So you can see this cross section here. In the foreground are the Castlereagh Hills. To the right hand side, you've got the Hollywood Hills and the Dundonald Gap in between, and then that river with the number 5. That's the Conswater River. I passed it today, and it really is quite wide at its estuary. And certainly in those times, it would have been a more powerful flowing river. And it's great to see what the work that's going on there and on the Greenway, and the work that's been done around the Conswater River. So if you sort of link that back up into the Castlereagh Hills, then we're talking about where Con O'Neill's castle would have been, and then the settlement would have been in and around that valley, if you like, that white valley. And then in front of it you have like mud flats and so on. So the reasons why early man would have settled in a place was, first of all, there was water, where, you know, which is absolutely essential for life. There was grazing for any cattle, because these people were moving from hunter-gatherer into you know, actually becoming farmers and so on, and developing forms of agriculture. There would have been wood for building and also shelter. And of course, although Belfast, as it sits, is a very marshy, swampy area, the valley itself, certainly below the Castlereagh hills, would have been a good place for shelter. You've got shelter on the far side from the Divis Mountains and so on, and you've got shelter on the other side from Castlereagh. It's almost like a bowl. So in a sense, Belfast was an ideal place for settlement, and this in a children's book actually shows that quite well. The other thing there would have, well, we'll move on anyway. That's enough. So this is a great. If you look at, I think it's Philip Armstrong is the artist, and if you have a look at his site, he's done lots of historical paintings. I got into trouble in my book because I put one in the book without asking permission, but I managed to blag my way out of it. It was owned by Carrick Council, but there are some brilliant illustrations, and this is one of. I'm not sure how much of the screen you can see, but this is one of the Belfast area, and in early times, and you can just see at the top, I think you can hopefully see the Giant's Ring as the Lagan meanders its way through. And then if you look across the countryside, you can just see these small ring settlements, and you can also see it's obviously a little bit later on, and you can see some hill structures, man-made hill structures, which of course would be Norman mottes and Bailey. So you can also in the foreground, just as the Lagan begins to open out, or the estuary of the Lagan, you can see the long bridge, because this would have been the place of the where there was initially a ford, that whether it was at low tide, people were able to get across, and then eventually there would have been some sort of stepping logs or stepping stones, and then a bridge that was put in there. But you can see at this stage, Belfast on the right-hand side of the bridge is fairly tiny. It's insignificant, and the bigger settlement would, of course, have been down along the coast a little bit towards Carrickfergus. But you can see there that it's a very forested area, woodland, scrub, it's swampy. Certainly Belfast in many ways was going to be a difficult place to settle, but I think this is a good sort of illustration to show us the sort of early times of Belfast. And at this time, and if we're moving on from the Giant's Ring and that sort of settlement and early man, we move into the sort of early Christian period, where around the period of 500 AD, the Irish would have been living in raths and or forts, and this, of course, the one we're looking at is Lisnabreeny, which is just up the road from us in Cregagh, and the Castlereagh hills are actually dotted with these. And if you look in any field as you're going past and you see a ring of trees, it may not be signposted that this is a rath, but it will be. If you see a ring of trees and a slightly raised earthen rampart, that will have been a rath. And thank goodness, if you're up the Castlereagh hills, you'll see farms where the farmer has actually left it. There's a great one just outside Ballygown to Cumber. Is everybody hearing me, by the way?
Mm-hmm.
Yep, that's okay. I'm just hoping that I'm not talking to myself, which wouldn't be unusual. But there's a great one between Ballygown and Cumber up on the left-hand side as you drive towards Cumber. But Lisnabreeny is a fantastic example of a rath or a ring fort, and the way the authorities have left it, that you can walk around it and you can walk down towards Lagan College and so on, as long as you've got oxygen tanks ready. It's a fairly steep old climb, but it's a beautiful place. And that hold on, see if I can get, yeah, there we are, the Lisnabreeny Rath, which is, of course, the Irish for the dwelling of the fairies, or the fort of the fairies, in Irish. But this would have been a settlement where our ancestors would have been living in a some sort of fortified structure. It would usually have been with a raised rampart, And the soil from that formed that rampart would have also then created a ditch, which again was a sort of a protection for those who would go inside. Quite often there were two rings, so it gave like a double skin, if you like. And into that area would have been, there may have been a main house of some form, probably a fairly temporary structure, and there would have been some place for animals to be brought in, particularly in, I suppose, in the winter, and also then if there were fears about wolves or cattle raiders from the locality. But quite often these were built on hillsides so that they gave, again, those who had been inside the rath would have been able to see anyone who was coming who wouldn't necessarily be welcome. In the external area, then they would have started to plant corn and various grains, and so sometimes I think we're given to this notion that the Irish, basically they had cattle and sheep and goats, and the land was pretty much left. Now, there is an element of that. There certainly were improvements that came later in time, but that's true of all the history of all sort of civilizations. But the Irish also planted a significant amount of ground, particularly around settlements. And you can see in this illustration, again by Philip Armstrong, you'll see some basic field structures. Now, it's unlikely that they actually had fenced fields, because they just didn't tend to do that. Fencing came really with the onset of plantation, although around the monasteries, it's quite probable and possible that they did have some form of field structure. But land was generally taken to be communal, and perhaps controlled by an overall chief, but largely the agricultural land would have been around the small settlements. There were really no major towns or settlements that until the like of Armagh, Downpatrick, Bangor, and those places started to grow. And usually they were growing up around a monastic settlement, which really brings us, here's just a map from the 1800s, from the 19th century of Lisnabrini. And if you just look here on this small area of Lisnabrini, just up there in the Castlereagh Hills, there they go. There are 6 raths on that small area of land. So these raths, there were connections between them, whether they be family connections. And you can see up in the left-hand corner, there are 3 raths together. Now, I didn't get time to work out where these all are, but I thought, that wasn't unusual on that map to see all of these dwellings. So that would have been the early settlements. Now, whether they settled in this way on the plain below the Castlereagh Hills, I don't know. It seems more likely that they would have taken to the high ground. But there are certainly strong evidence for settlements and in the raths that still exist. Thank goodness they still exist on our hillsides. So the other aspect around this time was the influence of the church, and the big influence in our area would have been St. Columb or St. Columba. He was taught by an abbot called Finian, and I think at the top of the Castlereagh Road, just up above the dental surgery and the doctors, there's St. Finian's Church. Am I right in that? I think so. That was named after this abbot who was the teacher of St. Columba. Now, there's an interesting story that in those days, obviously, the Bible wasn't printed; it was written, it was handwritten, and St. Finian, to give him his title. We'll not go into the theology of that, but he had a psalter, a written psalter that was very precious, probably a very ornate book. And it's told that Columba went into the part of the church. This was in Donegal, I think, where St. Finian kept this book, and he at night he would write it down for himself, and then he took the copy, and there was a whole to do about it, because St. Finian wasn't too happy. He wasn't for the spreading of the good word, and he didn't want St. Column to have the book. And it went to one of the local chieftains to make a decision on it, and he said basically, to every cow there's a calf. And by that he was saying, no, this is St. Column, this is Column's right, and he was allowed to keep the book. He also, incidentally, and I just remember this when taking the children over to stay in Scotland with the school trip. I remember being told, and never thought this anything of it really, but St. Column had an encounter with the Loch Ness monster, and it's the first recorded account of the Loch Ness monster. And what happened was, he was staying at the mouth of the River Ness, and he came across a scene where someone had been killed by a monster coming out of the river. And Colum, he sent someone in. He was obviously off on a missionary journey, and he sent someone into the water to retrieve the body. And the monster came out again, still its hunger hadn't quite been sated, and went to attack one of the Column's servants. And Colum immediately told it to be still, and the beast retreated into the water. And he dismissed it into Loch Ness. So the legend goes. So you didn't think that lowly little Knock, Columkill, and the church there that is at the along the carriageway as you go towards as you go past the garage. There's the graveyard there on the left on the carriageway, which is the old graveyard at Knock, which is where the church at Knock Columkill used to be. It's no longer there. So, and that was founded by St. Column. In fact, he founded something like 26, or maybe it was 40, I can't remember, different churches and monasteries before he was 25 in Ulster. So he's quite a prolific preacher. His name means dove of the dove. So St. Columkill is really, he's a dove of the church, or it's the hill. Knock is hill, and Kill is church. So it's the hill of Column's church, or the church on Column's Hill, or whatever way around you want to take it. But again, it's from the Irish. And that happened in around the 6th century, so in the 500s. I think he died towards the end of the 500s. He was a descendant of Niall of the Nine Hostages. Now, Niall of the Nine Hostages is a really important figure. I can't go into detail now, but you can read about him in the book if you'd like to find out a wee bit more about him. But so Colum was actually of royal lineage, and he gave that up for his monastic missionary life, and he would be very famous throughout Ireland and Scotland. And of course, a lot of schools are named after him, St. Colum's and St. Columkills and so on. So he was a descendant of Niall of the Nine Hostages. And the reason I'm flagging up Niall of the Nine Hostages is because, as we will see, this man who became, if you like, the father of the O'Neills, has significance for us, because the O'Neills would come to be centred in Castlereagh, Cregagh, and the environs here. Of course, then the church at Knockcolmkill would have been received patronage from John de Courcy, the Norman knight who came across with Strongbow. And here is an important point that's often missed in Irish history. Number one, the Normans were not English. They were Anglo-Normans who had come across and given the English a beating in 1066. So, number two, they were invited to Ireland. They didn't invade, they were invited by the King of Leinster, who had lost his crown, and he sent a message across, and the Normans, the Anglo-Normans, were invited to restore him to his throne, which they did, and Strongbow married into the royal family and so on. And then, of course, various bits and pieces that maybe shouldn't have happened. But anyway, that's history. So John de Courcy set off with 22 knights and 300 foot soldiers. He set off to conquer Ulster, and he did it by taking on the King of Ulster at the time, or King of part of Ulster, called Rory MacDunleavy. He defeated him at Downpatrick. And one of the things that John de Courcy did was to reinter the bodies of St. Patrick and St. Bride, and I can't remember the other one. 3 saints that would have been associated with Ireland. And so the big stone that's there for St. Patrick is really the reason that we think that that's where St. Patrick is buried. It relates back to John de Courcy, the Norman knight. He was a magnificent figure of a man. I mean, he was just a colossus. He's, in a sense, he reminds me of James Cregagh, the first Prime Minister of Northern Ireland, a giant of a man. But John de Courcy was a giant of a man in battle. In fact, when he was defeated by Hugh de Lacy, he was taken in church because they feared that at all other times he was wearing his armor and he would basically take out anybody who came. In fact, on that day when they took him, he took down 13 men with him. He wasn't killed, but he was captured, and at that time he was removed from his seat of power in Ulster. But he was associated with the Norman Moat that would have been at Shandon and still is there, up near the Shandon Golf Course, and that would have been a place associated with John de Courcy. So, our little area, yes, we're associated with the this great Norman leader who actually conquered the eastern part of Ulster, built Dundrum Castle and Carrickfergus Castle, and also then began a series of building of series of Moat and Bailey castles throughout the region. And then towards the 15th century, in the 1400s, the church at Knockcolmkeel became received patronage from a man called Niall Moore O'Neill, who was the chief of the Clannaboy, and we'll find out a little bit more about that. But monastic settlement at the time, so we have monastic settlement very close to Cregagh at Knockcolmkeel, and we also have it at Mahee Island, which again, not so far away. We have Movilla in Ards, we have Muckamore Abbey and so on, and there are other places, Grey Abbey, not so far away either. But this one at Mahee, this is another drawing by Philip Armstrong, and this shows they discovered recently that there was a tidal, I can't remember the mine's gone blank. Basically for powering the water, they used the tide coming in, and this was only discovered again recently. So this is a really good illustration of the monastic settlement on Mahee Island there. But so obviously Christianity had its part to play, and when these Christian centers established themselves, there would then be trades around the church or the monastery or the religious settlement, and people would start to accumulate in that area at that time. So a piece of Irish here. Now, obviously, Irish is controversial in Northern Ireland. Why wouldn't it be? Because everything else is controversial in Northern Ireland. Ulster Scots is controversial. Irish is controversial. My love is Ulster Scots. But as I was researching for the book on Con O'Neill, I also developed an affinity and affection for Irish, not a political one, but for the beauty of the language and how it, quite often, an Irish term is actually telling a story. It's very literal, but it actually describes, in simple words, what the place looks like or what the place is noted for. So as we go round our area, we don't find a great deal of association with Scots terms, to be honest. There are some associations in the more modern street names with military heroes, with Derby horse winners and things like that. There are more modern associations like Montgomery, for instance, Montgomery Road and things like that. All these names are more recent, but the townland names where we live tend to be Irish terms that have then been anglicised and given because if you're listening to, if you put yourself into the shoes of an Englishman coming over to settle in around the Belfast region, the Lagan Valley region, you're hearing this word. It's not really going in, so you're saying, or you're writing what you hear, and you're putting it into an anglicised term. So a lot of the things like listen to Shara and listen to Brini, these are all from Irish terms, and they're all anglicised forms of Irish terms. And and I think we should own that. I think we should own it. How long? Somebody said about being a blow-in, and I think Elisa said about being a blow-in. 20 years in Monterey and you're a blow-in. That's probably true. But how long do you have to be in Ireland to be a blow-in? And the quicker we accept the traditions that we have and say that, well, I'm living here in this part, and this is part of my history. This is part of what happened in this place. So I'm owning it. I may not totally identify with A, B, and C, but I'm owning the history, warts and all. And part of that is owning Ulster Scots and accepting it. And I think more and more people are, because they're realizing that there's more to it than just meets the eye, and the derogatory way in which it's been treated in the early 90s has started to fade, and that's good. But equally, I think we can learn to love Irish as a cultural language and traditions and so on. So it's up for debate. But I think certainly, if you take, there's Listen to Brini, the Fort of the Fairy Dwelling, Knockbracken. I can't even see what's on my screen, folks. I can't even read it, but it's you can see it there. Clontanacally is probably the meadows of O'Kelly, and Ballykeel is the narrow place. So all these terms that we know of, and these townlands that still exist today and are still on street signs today, are Irish terms. And all the townlands, there's a nice one that I found on, the different townlands that we're looking at: Cregagh, Castlereagh, Slattery, crossing the Cregagh. I probably didn't say that right. That's Slattery one, because it's new to me. Ballykeel, Clontanacally, Knockbracken, Ballymaconachie, Listen to Brini. All of these townlands have their roots in Irish. And of course, Castlereagh itself, which got me thinking about the book that took me over 10, it actually took me over 10 years to write, but 10 years sounded better. Because if you said it took you 16 years, people would think, what on earth were you doing? But the Grey Castle and Castlereagh, and I wouldn't even know if that's the right pronunciation, but that's the term that, for our district, Castlereagh, and it's Irish. Slattery, 80s Memorial or 80s Cairn, crossing the Cregagh, the cross of the tree or the branch. Ballymaconachie, is that Maconachie? I can't see it. See Maconachie's Meadow, and Cregagh, of course, which I finally got to Cregagh and Cregagh, the rocky place. And isn't that interesting when we think of, well, I'll come to that in a second. But would the real Cregagh stand up? Because when you're thinking of the Cregagh, I think of the Cregagh Road. But and I think of the Cregagh Estate. But the problem here is that if you look at a modern map, the bit on the left that you can see there is the Cregagh Estate. Okay. It's actually in the townland of Ballymaconachie. And the bit that is written as, well, hold on, do this. There you go. Cregagh. That's the Cregagh townland. Now that has the top of the Cregagh Road on the doctor's side and St. Finian's Church. But then it sort of shoots in. So most of what we're talking about as Cregagh is actually Ballymaconachie. And Cregagh goes up there on the Castlereagh Hills. And over a bit, I just want you to note Castlereagh. If you just look at that Castlereagh, the green circle, you can see settlement there. And although that's a modern map, I think what you'll see in historical maps is that there's settlement there for quite a long time as well. And of course, that's the association with the castle and the settlement that had risen up there. So for our purposes, we're thinking of Cregagh as it can be Ballymaconachie or Cregagh, wherever it wants to be. We know what the Cregagh is to us, extending down there into Belfast, down the Woodstock and so on, and up into the hills at Lisnabrina. So the boundary between the townland of Cregagh and Ballymaconachie is the beautiful Cregagh Glen. Haven't they done a fantastic job there as well? A beautiful walkway. I remember taking the children from Knockbreed up there to on a walk, and we did a bit of a clean-up. And unfortunately, I remember one little boy, I think I can remember his name, I'll not mention him, but I'm sure Alison remembers him. And he, of course, came out of the stream with a magazine that was totally inappropriate, and I had to quickly put that into a black bin bag and move on. But those are the things that happen in school. But there's the beautiful Cregagh Glen. So again, we'll not spend time there. There's the actual Cregagh that we know, reaching up into the Four Winds there. So, okay, so Cregagh means rocky place, and of course there we have it, the rocky road. You know, so street names and townland names are never really that far from the truth, especially the old ones. There's always something in them that we can learn from, and I think studying place names is a fantastic, it's a great way of getting to connect with history. Lisa, I'm conscious of time. Am I?
Carry on, Roy. It's all grand.
Go ahead. All right.
If people need to go off, sure. I'm recording the session, so if people need to go on, I can send them the recording afterwards.
Okay.
So work away.
So we're all familiar with the Cregagh Road. I have another school story, taking a football team on a shortcut up to Lochview Integrated School from Knockbreed. I was going up. I decided to go up the rocky road, and of course, as I turned the bend, a lorry appeared just around, and I have to confess, an expletive came out of my mouth. But I think in the circumstances, it was understandable. But and we did win the game, so all was well. So the next sort of character that we spoke a wee bit about there was John de Courcy. This isn't John de Courcy, but a Norman knight. There's a great book out recently, a wee book, local history book about John de Courcy. Stephen, someone wrote it, but he's a great story. I remember studying him in primary school. In fact, I had a picture on the radio in P5. Now, I don't know if there's many people that are famous for having a picture on the radio, but I had a picture of Carrickfergus Castle on the radio when I was in P5, and in the good old days back then in Beaver Primary School. So John de Courcy, we've spoken about him already, and we've mentioned all of those things, so we'll move on there. Quite a character. But he, of course, then began... part of this was to do with defence, and part of it was to do with settlement and control of the area, and beginning to develop his power base. So in County Down, there are probably more than 40 mots and bailies. Now, sometimes it was just the mot, which is, or sometimes in Dundonald it's called Moat Park, but it's the hill, the man-made hill is the mot where they put the keep, and then down below would have been more of a flat area below, which would have had the cattle and folk who were connected with the settlement, who would have lived there. And then, of course, in the time of trouble, they'd have all piled up the hill into the keep and pulled up the drawbridge across the ditch. So again, have a look at Philip Armstrong's site. He is phenomenal. I mean, his artwork is amazing, and this, I think, this is obviously a very large Mott and Bailey structure. This one's in Ballymena at Clough, but you can see, you get the whole idea of what was going on and how that small settlement started to grow up around the place of the Moat and Bailey, and he would have started to do things like tax. So I imagine, in my sort of way of thinking, I reckon that his 22 knights got the best choice of the land and built they wouldn't have just built moats, they'd have built Moat and Baileys. They were there to settle. They would have been the ones who had been getting income from the land. And I was looking at there's in the 1300s there was a census type of document, a papal roll or something like that, and they actually paid for. You could pay by giving an otter skin. You could pay by you could pay this is your rent for the area around the settlement, the moat. You could pay by giving a pair of silver spurs, because they were obviously horse riders, and these were knights and barons. And you could pay, another form of payment was a pound of pepper. Now, I don't know, I can't work out, did they actually grow pepper, or did they buy this in? Were they trading outside? And it would seem more likely that it was something that was brought in. We know that salt was a very precious, the Romans paid their soldiers in salt. But pepper, I know spice was very important, but obviously there were trading links outside. Or did they grow pepper? Is it possible? I don't know. Highly unlikely. So in our area, the Mount, now I don't know that it's still there. I don't think it is, but the Mount should have been a clue, shouldn't it? That there was a moat there, and of course that would be a good place, because that would have been near the ford. That would have been near the crossing place. That would have been near the church at Belfast. That would have been near the castle, or could well have been the preliminary form of the castle at Belfast. So there was so just down the bottom of the Cregagh Woodstock, you've got the Mount, and there was a Norman moat there. You've got one at Knock, which is over next Shandon Golf Course. You've got one at Glen, which was Ballymaken then was called, and that's actually where Con O'Neill is thought to have been buried. So there was a monastery there as well, and there was a moat, a Norman moat. And if you look at the Raven maps, you can actually see the moat and a house built beside it, which was the house that would become what is now the dwellings at Moat Park. Of course, that's a new building, but you can see that in as you go out towards Hollywood at Glen. There was also one at Dundonald. Now, the one at Dundonald was actually held by the Earl of Ulster, William de Burgh. William de Burgh was killed when he was 24, 25 years old. He was called the Brown Earl, and basically his death, and he was murdered by his fellow Normans. He was basically taken out, and somebody came up behind him and crushed his skull with an axe, because he had interred one of this man's relatives and starved him to death, basically, in prison. And so that was payback time. But that was basically when the Norman earldom was basically falling apart. The Bruce brothers had invaded, Robert and Edward the Bruce, mostly Edward, had invaded Ireland in 1315, and that really shattered the stranglehold of the Anglo-Normans in Ulster. And really then with the killing of the Brown Earl in 1333, that was bringing things not to a conclusion, but certainly weakened them. And of course then we have the moat. What's happening here, folks? Oh, there we go. We have the moat at Beaver, which is still there, in Beaver Forest Park. And this is that slide is obviously taken probably at the end of the 1800s, I would imagine, and it's then used as a sort of ornamental walkway at the big house at Beaver, which of course was destroyed in the 60s, 1960s. Shame that was destroyed and not kept. But this would have been the moat at Beaver, and again an important place, because it was right on the banks of the Lagan. And again, that would have been a place that would have been important to protect as well. Beaver is close to and part of Galwally. And incidentally, I'm not even going to try and read the Irish there, but Galwally basically means the townland of foreigners, or the townland of the Gauls. So, the local Irish folk who would have been there knew these settlers as Gauls and foreigners. And so Galwally, which is where Forestside is, incidentally, Forestside was named by a Knockbreda pupil, Andrew McIntyre, way back at a competition. He won a Chelsea strip and an Apple Mac computer for the school. So there you go. So Galwally is the townland of the Gauls. So that the Gauls being French, the townland of the Normans, the Anglo-Normans. So bit of eye candy. This is brings us to another phase in the development of the area, and really brought me to why I wrote the book. This guy is it's obviously not him, but is called Aboy. Now I'm told that's the pronunciation in Irish, Aboy. It means yellow hue, and yellow hue was of the O'Neills in Tyrone. So if you think of the top of Loch Ness, and you go to the top of Loch Ness on the left-hand side, so you're talking about Tyrone and South Londonderry, that's where he lived. He was born in 1230 AD, and he was a great-grandson of Hugh the Lazy-Arsed Boy. Hugh the Lazy-Arsed Boy got his nickname. The Irish names for chiefs and so on are amazing. They're absolutely astounding. But this is my favourite of all time. Hugh the Lazy-Arsed Boy was given the name, and it wasn't a derisory name. It was a name because he refused to stand up in the presence of McQuillan, who was then the chief of Tyrone. He refused to stand. He kept his seat, and so he was given the title Lazy-Arsed Boy. His grandfather rescued him from an early death on that occasion, but he went on to become a leader in Tyrone and chief. And his grandson, or great-grandson, was this man called Aboy. Aboy became the ruler of Tyrone, the Tyrone O'Neill, the big, powerful family in Ulster, the O'Neills. And he became chief in 1263. And it's when he died, now they did tend to give tremendous eulogies that you would have to take with a pinch of salt, because all of these men were the greatest men that ever lived and walked the earth, and they clearly weren't. But he was, in part of his title, was given the title of heir to the throne of Ireland. He was a powerful man. He tried for a time to fight the Normans. This was before the invasion of the Bruces and the weakening of the earldom. And he tried to fight the Normans, but he actually sent to Norway, to the King of Norway, and offered him the throne of Ulster, in fact, the throne of Ireland, if he would come and deal with the Normans. But that was refused. So the next plan was that he married the niece of the Earl of Ulster at the time. He married Eleanor de Nangle. So, and when you think of that, here is the great Irish chieftain, the great O'Neill, marrying into the Anglo-Norman bloodline. And I think sometimes we have to have a look at this and think there are very few pure blood Celts walking the face of this land today. They married Vikings, they married Normans, they married Scots, they married English, they married Welsh, they married Manx, they're now marrying Polish. We are a mixed people. And certainly they're at the very root and core of the Clannaboy O'Neills, in the very bloodline of what would become the Clannaboy O'Neills, who would come to live in where we are now, marrying into the Anglo-Norman family. He was killed by Bernard McMahon, but such was his greatness that thereafter he was called Yellow Hugh because of his yellow, fair, golden hair. And thereafter, his family were known as the Clan of Yellow Hugh, the Clan Aboy or Aboy, Clannaboy, which comes down in its anglicised form to Clannaboy or Clandy Boy. So when you're talking about Bangor and Clannaboy Park, where Bangor play their football, or Clannaboy Yogurt, or Clannaboy Estate, or all these places, we're talking about the beginnings of this is the 13th century in Tyrone, the Clannaboy, the clan of yellow hue, the clan Ebwy, Clannaboy. So how on earth did they ever get to where we are? What association has Tyrone with us? Well, basically what happened was there were two strong families in the O'Neill line. One was the Clannaboy, and one was another part of the family, also called O'Neill. They got the upper hand. So basically the Clannaboy were pushed around from Tyrone, around into South Londonderry, around across the Bann. And this is taking place about 1340. And so they're starting to move across the Bann, and they're being pulled there. They're being pushed there by the stronger family of the O'Neill, but they're being pulled there by the prospect of new land and territory, because the earldom is weakening. So the Bruce invasion, the weakening of the earldom, and the push of the stronger family of O'Neill pushes the Clannaboy across the Bann, around the top of Loch Ness, round past Toome, and then they start to conquer in Antrim. And the families that are living there are Gaelic families. The O'Flynn's were the powerful family in that area at the time. They dealt with the O'Flynn's. They dealt with the Norman families, the Whites, the Mandevils, the Jordans, the Savages who were sent down to Alison's neck of the wood in Portaferry. These people, these Normans were sent to the margins by this wave of the Clannaboy, led by Henry Boy, the the grandson of Yellow Hugh. And so they gradually came down along Loch Ness until they crossed the Lagan. And so it is from this family, this powerful family in Tyrone, that the area that we now know as Castlereagh, the area south of the Lagan, became their territory. And not only did it just sit around Belfast, it stretched out towards Lisburn. It stretched in the other direction to Bangor and down towards Portaferry. Now, there was a little section at the tip of the peninsula that was kept purely by the Savages, the Savage family, an Anglo-Norman family who maintained that down around Portaferry. It stretched down towards Crossgar, out to Saintfield, carried off, you name it. That was the lower territory of the Clannaboy. They also controlled a lot of Antrim as well, but the bit we're interested in is the lower part, which was incidentally called Upper Clannaboy. So the lower part below the Lagan was called Upper Clannaboy, and the part above the Lagan was called Lower Clannaboy. And the reason for that is because Dublin was the focal point. So that was the perspective on it. That's why it was called Upper Clannaboy. Anyway, that's the O'Neill. So that this couple of little drawings shows the dotted part is where the Clannaboy were in the initial stages, and then gradually they start to come down into Antrim, and then eventually in the third position there in the 15th century. They are in the 1400s. They are in Castlereagh and Cregagh, and down the Ards Peninsula as well. So, what started me thinking about writing a book? Well, it was about Castlereagh. This isn't Castlereagh, and it's probably too grand. But if you can imagine the sort of settlements that the Irish had at this time, they were small temporary dwellings, very few stone buildings. This would have been a skyscraper on the horizon. The English called it the Eagle's Nest. It was perched up beside Lochview School, just in the field beside the Orange Hall. That's where the castle was situated. And it's said that instead of preserving the castle, they took the stones and used it to build a wall around where the castle stood. Now, whether that's true or not is another story, but it's actually recorded in Hansard. Castlereagh means grey or mottled castle. So it may well have been a speckled castle of some sort. It may have been dusky. It may have been a castle that didn't have a whitewash of lime. I don't know. But it was probably 4 stories high. So it would have been a significant building. Was probably built in the 1400s, maybe into the early 1500s. Some people say 1300s, but that seems very unlikely. It's certainly mentioned that the Clannaboy, the chief of the Clannaboy, was the lord of Castlereagh in the 1400s. So I think there's a case to be made that this castle was built in the 1400s. And here's a map, one of the Downshire maps that actually shows the site of the castle. You can see it there on the. Why is this? Oh, I mustn't have. Hold on. My battery's running low. I didn't have the electricity on. Sorry, that's this back in the game. So on this map, you can see position 24 would be Castlereagh Presbyterian Church. So that's the road. That's the church road coming up the hill. And position 23 would probably be where Lochview School is now. So Lochview School. Position 15 is the playing fields. And if you go over to the top left, the building over to the left of the church, well, that must be Leatham Cottage that we can see at the top there. But you can see very clearly the castle on this map, Con O'Neill's castle. You wonder sometimes when people, why more people don't know of. I think more people do know today of its existence, and Castlereagh Council has done some work in the past on that and put up a lot of good signage, some of which is incorrect, but never mind. But at least his name's being mentioned. Of course, we have Con O'Neill, Conswater Avenue. I was married in Consbrook Church. I lived in Consbrook Avenue. I was a BB officer in Consbrook Congregational Church. I stayed off school and going to Conswater Shopping Centre and so on. So we've all a good tradition with. I did my teaching practice in Elm Grove School beside the wee bridge. Now there's some dispute about the bridge. Some people say it's just a Victorian folly. Well, I have a map in the book dating to 1673, I think it is, and on the map is Conswater and Cons Bridge. So it's there. I'm content that it's not a Victorian ornament. Some people say King William crossed it. I think that's probably nonsense. How would you get an army going to the Boyne across that wee bridge? But anyway, we have on our doorstep, we have these great monuments to the past. There's the map, the modern map, set against the Downshire map, because of course the territory became the Downshire estate, and of course in Cregagh we have the Downshire Road and so on. So the Downshire name is there. Of course, they didn't. The Hill family that took control of the castle didn't really want it, to be honest. They did it up, and then abandoned it and built bigger and better out at Hillsborough. Well, wouldn't you want to live in Hillsborough anyway? I mean, it makes sense. So that's the map, and you can see very clearly how it all lines up. It's really, really, really very good. I would love there to be a proper excavation at some time. I know there has been one, but I think they dug in the wrong place. And then, of course, just across the playing fields on the other side of the road, where the plantation is, as you go up the Ballygowan Road, you come to that strange road, and you turn to the left, you go to Hillmount Nursery, and there's a plantation. Well, just in that plantation is where the inauguration mound of the O'Neills was and is still there. So we have this now. It's very hard to get to, and it's very overgrown. But this would have been where the chair of the O'Neills was found in the 1800s. Now I didn't know that they had it actually out on display until I had a few friends over from Poland recently. We went to the Ulster Museum, and there it is sitting out on display, and you can touch it. You can touch the chair of the O'Neills. You can touch the coronation chair of the O'Neills. Now, these inaugurations of their chieftains were strange affairs, and people say, oh really, did that happen? Well, if you have a look at the inauguration or the coronation of Queen Elizabeth, there's some weird stuff going on there, and all of that weird stuff goes back in time. She was crowned on top of a stone, held in a chair, King Edward's chair, the Stone of Destiny. That stone came from Ireland to Scotland, you know. So the coronation of Irish chieftains and the standing on top of the chair and turning round 3 times and receiving a wand of hazel and being anointed and all those things. Oh, a lot of those things happened to our Queen. And it's great that we still have this chair. It's great because it's the only one in Ireland, the only one. Wouldn't it be great if it was brought back to Castlereagh? Wouldn't it be great if there was an interpretive centre in Castlereagh to house this and the ring of the Tyrone and Eels and so on that you can go and see in the Ulster Museum? There's a record of the castle at Castlereagh being that 2 English captains. There was a they tried to make a settlement in Upper Clannaboy. They tried to take over from a man called Brian McPhelim, who was the Irish chief in this area at the time. And they wanted to basically send him out into the woods across the River Lagan. And some of the names there, these were the names of people who were considered to be Irish troublemakers: the Sloot Neil, McNeil Og, Henry High, McBrien Carter, the Sepps of the families of the Kellys, Patrick McNeil, and so on. So these are some of the names of people who lived in our area, the wild Irish, who were a lot of trouble. But their attempt to take over Brian McPhelim's land failed. Of course, Brian McPhelim did come to a nasty end in Belfast Castle when he was slaughtered by the first Earl of Essex, and that's a really nasty story. If you want to read it, it's in the book. This map, it's not a really good version of the map, but this map is from 1570s as well. And I just want you to see on the left-hand corner that the area around Belfast at the mouth of the Lagan is completely, at 1570, is completely woodland. You can see it there. There's no other place in the map that is drawn with such dense woodland and forest. This is what our area looked like. You can see Conswater River going out there, just almost at the mouth of the Lagan. And you can see coming up into the hills, it's all woodland. So in 1570, Belfast is just a small place. All the settlement is down there towards Carrickfergus on the far side of the loch. And you can see Hollywood there. There's a few wee scrapings of buildings and as you would go down the coast towards Hollywood. And of course at Bangor, as you go towards the bottom right-hand corner of the map, you can see Bangor. And the Copeland Islands, by the way, are named after the Copelands who came over with the Normans in 1171. In 1600, Castlereagh Castle was attacked. Con O'Neill and his family were attacked in Castlereagh Castle by Brian McCart from Tyrone. This was in the 9 Years' War. Brian McCart was the strong man of Hugh O'Neill, who was the Earl of Tyrone. And it's said that when, I can't see the lieutenant's name, Hilditch or Gildrich or Goodrich or something like that, can't remember. He went out and he had to walk a quarter of a mile to get his water. And I wonder, from the castle, did he walk to the left and go towards Cregagh Glen, or did he walk to the right and go down towards Glenview, where there's a river there, goes past the wee power station at Glenview Avenue? So who knows? But we know that the castle itself didn't have a well, so they had to go out of the castle, which was unusual, to get their water. This is a map of the area that around that time, and you can see the different families. Castlereagh is called Gallo, and there are lots, if you looked at that map, and we don't have time, lots of church lands as well, like St. John, Newton Priory, Moville Abbey. They all had church lands. These were very important, and that's why when Henry VIII took the church lands, I mean, he was taking a fair bit, a chunk of the British Isles when he chose to do that, because the church controlled so much land. But again, you can see in this little map Castlereagh sitting there, and also the forest land all around it. So the population was probably in this part of Upper Clannaboy, right away round to the Ards, was probably only about 36,000. Around 1600. The 9 Years' War, starvation and famine had taken care of a lot of the population, but Ireland was a very sparsely populated place. It's reckoned that between Antrim and Down there were only 12,000 males. So if you sort of take 6,000 for Down and add in the women they married, there's 12,000, and give them 4 children in a family, it takes you up towards 36, 40,000. It's not a massive population for this vast area that the Upper Clannaboy O'Neills controlled, because remember they control all of this right down to almost the very tip of the Ards Peninsula. The main settlements were, of course, Castlereagh, Holywood, Bangor, Cumber, Newton Ards, and Grey Abbey, quite often around church-based settlements. I'm not going to have time to go into all of this, but you'll know the story of Con O'Neill and how that there was a grand party. They ran out of wine. It was Christmas Eve or around Christmas time. Sent out for wine, which he had hidden probably down the Conswater River somewhere. And tax collectors, English tax collectors and soldiers caught the servants coming back up to the castle with the wine, because there'd be no tax paid on the wine. Of course, why would an Irish chieftain pay tax to an English queen? And a struggle ensued. One of the Englishmen, soldiers, was killed, and so Con O'Neill found himself incarcerated in Carrickfergus Castle, and he was under sentence of death because he had already rebelled in the past. He'd already been in Carrick Castle before. This was his second time, and a man called Hugh Montgomery intervened. In the story you will maybe know of how he escaped the castle, but the reason Hugh O'Neill intervened was to get his hands on land in Ulster, and the price that was going to be paid was 50%. Con O'Neill agreed to give up 50% of his land to be sprung from prison. And what happened was Hugh Montgomery sorted that all out for him, took him by night across the loch to Bangor, where he hid in Bangor the tower of the church at Bangor, which still is there to this day. Now, the steeple bit wasn't there, but he hid there for 3 days before going to Scotland. And Hugh Montgomery, of course, being a friend of the king, the new king, King James I, was able to organise a pardon for Con, but the price was high. In fact, the price became higher because James Hamilton, who we will know, another Scottish lord, he intervened and got wind of this deal, and so it became a third for Hamilton, a third for Montgomery, and a third for Con O'Neill. He should have been landed, to be honest. You can see here the difference. The green part, the lime green part, is now the area that Con O'Neill would have held. He kept his lands around Castlereagh, certainly Cregagh, and extending out towards Lisburn. So he had a significant amount of land. In his share, you can see there, he initially had 244 townlands. In his new share, he had 67. In his new share, he had 66,000 acres. He had only to pay a crown rent of £33. If you took the revenue at 1 shilling per acre, which is what Montgomery charged, he could have had an annual income of over £3,000. He should have been on the pig's back. He was entitled to have a market every Thursday at Castlereagh, at the castle. I wonder, should we think about maybe revisiting that in modern times as a tribute to Con O'Neill and their past heritage? He was allowed to have a fair on the Feast of St. John once a year. I don't know when that is. He was allowed free warren and chase. He was meant to be set up as an English lord, almost after the English fashion. Free warren and chase means you can have deer, and you can go hunting, and you can have your lands, and you're the only one allowed to hunt there. You're the lord. He was set up. This was the plan, that he would have had a good life. Not the land he had before, but enough to be a very wealthy, prosperous man. He was to have his own court, so that if the pipe order court came from France, it came from the fact of people who were traders were traveling around the place, so their feet were dusty. And it was when there were markets, there were often squabbles. So somebody sold somebody a lame horse, then somebody had to adjudicate over it, and that was the pie powder or pea powder court, was for trade disputes. Court late was more for criminal issues, and he would have ruled on that at Castlereagh. And Court Baron, that was to do with his estate, so if there was somebody not paying their rents and so on. So Con O'Neill, things looked good for a while, but they soon deteriorated. And I mean, oh my goodness, look at the time. He began, of course, then hand over fist to lose his lands. And you can actually go and see these indentures, these documents, these legal documents that he signed, where he signed off his lands because he got into financial difficulties. Basically, he wasn't able to get tenants to come onto his lands. He wasn't able to collect his rents. He just got himself into a mess. He just kept mortgaging and leasing until eventually he ended up with nothing. Of course, Montgomery, Hamilton, and Moses Hill were all there in the background, ready to do the deals that were necessary. There's a signature of Con O'Neill. So for anybody who thinks he was Con with two N's, it wasn't. He signed it C-O-N. So there you go, and that's his actual signature. I did cry when I found that in the public record office. Not great guttering cries, but just a nice little whimpering cry when I was able to touch his signature on a document. I'm sure I'm well out of time, but Ballyrushboy, which is the area around Grand Parade, Orangefield, and Norby, that was one of the first lands he gave away. And he gave it to Thomas Montgomery. Thomas Montgomery had been part of the deal that sprung Con O'Neill from prison. And one of the first acts that he was a good man, obviously. One of his first acts was to honour Thomas Montgomery, who had whisked him away in his ship from Carrickfergus Castle. And he gave him the land around Galwally and also the Gala, which we now know as Castlereagh, Orangefield, Orby, and Grand Parade, and all those areas are named after Derby horses. I mean, it was like a fire sale. Ballylesson went to Hugh Montgomery. Also included in this was the timber, which is such a vital resource at that time. Castlereagh Manor, that's the broader manor, the domain, if you like, not the castle itself, went to Moses Hill. Breda and Galwally went to a man called Michael White, who used it for, again, deforestation, basically. A lot of this wood would have been going back to England, where the forests had already been cleared, and back to Scotland. Ballinafie was sold to a man called Thomas Hibbets. Ballymacarrot and Stranmore, I'm not sure where Stranmore is, but perhaps it's Strand Town, I don't know. Excluding the Church of Colmcille, because Con didn't want to give that away, was given to a Scot called David Boyd. Then in 1611, the castle itself was handed over to Moy's Hill. Clontonacally went to Con's brother, Hugh Murda, but then very shortly after, it was transferred to Folk Conway, who was the founder of the modern town of Lisburn. So there you have the Scots. We all know that they come in. You can see that they got most of the area over towards Strangford Lough, and Con kept his area at Castlereagh. The Scots came in like bees, it is said. Proud that there's a name Greer among the Scots that came over. They brought a new language, new religion, new building, new form of settlement, new education. Education was so important. We have the School of Montgomery and Nards. They brought, I can't see all my own stuff there. Can't see that. But one of the things that, hopefully you can see it, was sport. So the first football pitch in Ireland was at Newtonards. The first golf course in Ireland was at Newtonards. Montgomery brought these things into Ireland, and we should be celebrating these things. We should be celebrating this rich Ulster Scots history instead of being embarrassed after 400 years. We should be celebrating the fact of the influence that our ancestors have had on this part of Northern Ireland. Settlement grew up where there had been no real settlement before, and so you have streets laid out in Cumber, and you can see them. If you haven't visited the North Down Museum in Bangor, you should go and have a look at the maps there, the Raven maps. They are amazing. In 1625, all of the territory of Montgomery and Hamilton was mapped. Beautiful maps. So you have maps of Cumber, Holywood, Bangor, Killaloe, and so on. Here we see an early map of Cumber. This little map is this is a beautiful map. This happened in 1760. The French and the English, or the French and the British, had a 7 years war, and Carrick was actually taken. Carrickfergus was taken by a French ship for 5 days. A man called Captain Thurbo. But the thing about this little map that I really like is there's a settlement here. So this is 1760. You can see there's very little settlement between Belfast and the Castlereagh Hills. There's a place called Drum. I don't think that's the proper name. I think this is settlement around Castlereagh. You can see Ray is written up there, but it's more down the coast towards Holywood. So I think they've got that wrong. Anyway, they were French. How were they to know where everywhere was? But that would seem to indicate that there was some sort of settlement. And you can see the road heads off down towards Killaloe. So I'm reckoning that is somewhere up in the Castlereagh Hills, probably the settlement that would have existed around some sort of village structure at Castlereagh up by Lochview School. There we have Leatham House, still standing. They say that some of the stones from the castle were taken to build it. And of course, the church there dates to 1650, but this church wasn't actually built there in 1650. It was 1720 when the actual church was built there, because before that it was a shared venue. Anyway, these are some old paintings that from the 1800s. You can see on the left-hand side, and I'm going to be really quick here. On the left-hand side, you can see Knock Parish Church. And what I want you to notice is you can look down into Belfast and you can see the long bridge, and you can see the city of Belfast underneath the Cave Hill. But if you look into the foreground, it's all still grass, pasture, trees, forest. There is no real settlement in our area at that time. This is obviously out. This is a view probably from the from Forest Side, looking across. Again, this is the Lagan flowing through Beaver Forest Park. You can see the long bridge in the distance, and everything in the foreground is green. There's very little settlement in this area. So this is in the 1800s, the 19th century. And again, this is the house at Beaver. And looking down, you can see the bridge in the distance on the mouth of the Lagan. And again, in the foreground, there's nothing but pasture and green land. And if we think about it, all of the housing that came out of Belfast when the shipyard started to go and is all relating into the into the late 1800s, isn't it? And then it starts to come out, and you've got the shipyard workers being housed in and around the area of East Belfast, and those are all, you know, fairly modern in terms of history. But those are great pictures of there you can see on the left hand side Knock Parish Church and the Beaver big house and the estate, and looking up onto the Castlereagh Hills. I'd often thought and wondered, is there a picture somewhere that actually has Castlereagh Castle on it? Is there somewhere? And I've hunted for it and I can't find it. There is a photograph, this photograph of the site of Castlereagh Castle. That was taken at the end of the 1800s by a man called Welsh, and all that's remaining is the wall around it. But I think if you take 2 to 3 meters between each of those trees, that's a pretty big area as you look on it. This was a sizable castle, the Eagle's Nest. Finally, I'm going to very, very quickly scoot through this. If you want to look up the 1911 census for the area of Ballymaconachie, which is what we spoke about at the start, the area when we talk about Cregagh, here is a family, a Presbyterian family, a father who's a widower, and I just want you to look at the jobs, the sort of jobs they were doing in 1911. Labourer, dairyman, general labourer, and carpenter. And the lady of the family, the daughter, she has no occupation at the time. So those are the occupations that where this man was a widower. He lived in Ballymaconachie. They could all read and write, and you've got their ages, and you can see this online. and you can actually then see a version that's typed up, so you can actually make it all out. So there we are in Ballymaconachie in 1911, and these are the jobs. This one gets a little bit more interesting. In the townland of Ballymaconachie, part of Castlereagh, in North Down, in the barony of Upper Castlereagh, in the parish of Knockbreda, there are 11 dwellings, and we can see the number of persons who are in the houses, and we can see the religion of the persons. There are no Roman Catholics in the area. There are 10 Church of Ireland folk, and there are 17 and 19, 20, 36 Presbyterians. And then, interestingly, on the right-hand side, there are 8 people who are neither Catholic, Presbyterian, Methodist, Independent, Baptists, Quakers, or Jews. 8 people in 1911. I wonder, did they have no faith, or what faith were they? It's interesting to think. Maybe that's something that somebody could dig into, but that just tickled my fancy there on that one. But it gets even more interesting. Here we have a breakdown again of these 11, there are actually maybe a few more houses on here, but this really confused me when I looked at it, because it says outdwellings, and if you look at all those houses, there's 8 for that one, 13 for that, 9, 7, 6, 9, 8, 10, 7, 8, 7, 14, and 3 outbuildings. I was thinking, like, how on earth could that be? That can't be right. Surely to goodness. Well, yep. Let me see. And interestingly, it tells you about the type of roofs they had, and if you put in a 0, it's because it's a thatch roof. So there were a couple of thatched houses. All the rest had tin or tiles or slate. And I thought that was interesting, all those outhouses. But here's why. So what are we thinking about when we're thinking about 1911, just before the Titanic was built? The shipyard's on the go, of course. There's plenty of houses in East Belfast. But look at Ballymaconachie as we come out towards Cregagh. Here we have these different houses. And look at all the different things that are connected to these houses. There are stables, cow house, calf house, dairy, piggery, fowl house, boiling house, whatever that is, barns, turf house. There's no turf houses. There's a potato house. There's no workshops, sheds, storehouses, and a laundry connected with one. So all of these houses that were in the Ballymaconachie area at that time were actually farms or some sort of settlement around a farming type community. The one there, number 8, is interesting because it's a coach house. I wonder, is that the old coach house at Newtonbreda, the inns? Is that what that is? Is it possible? I don't know. Somebody else needs to look at all this and find it out. But there we have it. Beautiful picture of the Cregagh estate, a wonderful modern estate when it was built, and there's the architect. Folks, I've taken an hour and a half of your time, and I hope that I probably haven't left time for questions, but hopefully it's whet your appetite for a little bit of how the whole thing connects. I like to see how things connect, and it's taken us from early man right through to today. So thanks for listening.